Welcome back to the Stigma podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Hayes, and today's guest is Amanda Eilian, co-founder and partner at Aboutable Partners. I'm very excited to get to have Amanda here today. She's one of the investors that I look up to the most in the mental health space. I've learned so much from working with her and being in some deals together. She's truly amazing, and honestly, if I was a founder in the space, she'd probably be first or definitely at the top of my list of investors that I would want to approach. She's incredibly experienced as an operator and as an investor. A lot of other investors and a lot of founders in our space really trust and respect her feedback and the value that she provides as an investor to them. Able Partners, for those who may not be familiar, is an early stage VC firm supporting visionary founders in what they define as the positive living space. Their investments focus on companies that improve the daily lives of people, making them healthier, happier, and making their lives more meaningful. Some of the specific investment areas they focus on include mental health, where we have a ton of overlap with them at What If Ventures, addiction, women's health, sexual wellness, wellness broadly, coaching and continued learning, as well as childcare and self-expression, and a number of other areas as well. Amanda is one of the best investors I've worked with in the mental health space. I'll say it again. And she was investing in this space long before we entered the market at What If Ventures. She's led incredible early stage investments in companies like Spring Health, Compass Pathways, ATAI Life Sciences, Alma, Alto Neuroscience, and many others. Too many to list here. So I'm very excited to have her here today. So without further ado, let's get into it. Amanda, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Stephen. Excited to chat.
So I'd love to start by having you share a little bit about sort of your story, your bio and background, and kind of how you found your way into venture investing and creating Able Partners, if you wouldn't mind.
You know, I kind of stumbled into this a little bit. I grew up in rural Vermont, which I think motivated me to explore the world. And I thought I was going into government and particularly foreign affairs. I went to Georgetown's School of Foreign Service and was actually living in Venezuela while I was studying there, and got picked up by a Latin American mergers and acquisition group at one of the big investment banks based on that experience. And showing up there, I realized that there was so much going on and so much to learn in the world of finance, and potentially an opportunity to actually make a big difference from a different standpoint, and then really took off from there. So I was working at a private equity fund after that was focused on lifestyle investing, so very consumer focused. I love that job. I couldn't believe they were paying me to do it, and I knew I wanted to do more of it. I've spent most of my career in finance and in different areas of finance, direct investing primarily, but also am a co-founder myself, which I think is helpful for investors. I co-founded, grew and sold an enterprise software company, which we sold to Squarespace, and so that experience also informs my work from the investing side. But I made a decision that I really like spending time with founders and with companies, and more than just one company, more than just my own. And for the last decade plus, have been focused on early stage investing through Able Partners.
So I'd love to have you tell us a little bit about Able Partners and how it came together and what you guys are focused on.
Yeah, so it really came together. My co-founder, Lisa Blau, and we have a third partner, Allison Ryu now. But Lisa and I had been collaborating informally in the investment space. So we both had a deep interest in what's now called the wellness space, and a thesis around the fact that there was a long-term secular shift in consumer behavior towards better for you activities, products, and services. We collaborated on a few investments in that space, and realized that we were very aligned and we were onto something, and then formed the fund out of there. And as I said, when we first started investing about a decade ago, it was very focused, what's now known as wellness. So a lot of the early leaders in the wellness space, like Goop and Daily Harvest and Four Sigmatic and Moon Juice. And what we realized with our work over time was that, unfortunately, a lot of those wellness seeking behaviors that we had identified were actually being driven by underlying inadequacies, primarily in our healthcare system, but also in our food systems, in our support systems, And so we developed a thesis that we called the wellness gap. And that's something that we define as the delta between measures of economic well-being. So, in the United States, if you were to measure GDP per capita or the money that people have in their pockets, that continues to go up and to the right. But when you look at measures physical and emotional well-being in this country, in particular over the last 2 decades, you see a real gap emerging in that graph. Those measures of physical and emotional well-being have been stagnant to negative, unfortunately, for a period, for a while now, and has created this literal gap in the chart where you're showing economic wellness increasing, and yet people are frankly not feeling well. And so we are really interested in finding companies and founders who are looking to close that gap. And so that means that we have spent a lot of the last several years focused more at the intersection of consumer and healthcare. We still do pure play consumer, but have been increasingly focused on that intersection. We have another lens that we like to look at, appropriately enough for this podcast, a lens of stigma, where we're really interested in conditions and communities that have been underserved because of historical stigma. And, so within that, we have defined our universe fairly broadly, but ultimately the core focus of our investment mandate is to identify solutions helping to improve our overall health and well-being.
And what are some examples of what those, maybe the buckets are, or maybe some of the companies are that you've invested in that are scattered throughout the intersection of consumer and healthcare, with that overlaid by that lens of stigma?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, mental health is clearly an area that, we'll probably talk some more about. And, that's an area where, unfortunately, it's this twin pandemic, as people have talked about. It's a huge and growing problem, and in the last couple of years, and as you well know, even in the last year, has become an increasing area of focus, if not frenzy, in the investment community. But historically, had been something that individuals were not willing to talk about. There's a lot of stigma around mental health, and yet it's something that affects so many of us. And so, that was really probably the first area that we started looking at as part of this thesis. And then within mental health, you can break it down to a lot of categories. So we have pretty wide exposure within mental health. And so when we look at different categories, we include, addiction in there. We include pediatric mental health in that category. And then sort of as one of our buckets in terms of interventions that we think have a lot of promise, we invested in the therapeutic psychedelic space within that category. So, some of our investments include Spring Health, Alma, Tempest, Ellipsis, Little Otter, Kasana, Brave Health, Alto Neuroscience, and then in the psychedelic space, Compass Pathways, ATAI Life Sciences, Synthesis. And so it's a pretty broad range looking at interventions from a number of different angles.
So we are in a lot of deals with you. We love working with you. One of the things I respect the most about your work is that, mental health has become a sort of more common topic or more popular topic lately. It is more common now to see investors investing in the mental health space, but you identified this space long before that. You've been investing in this space for quite some time. How did you identify the mental health space, psychedelic space, back before really any of us latecomers got to this space?
Well, I don't think you're a latecomer, and I think unfortunately the size of the problem is large enough that there's a lot of opportunity for people. Look, I think that we have been able to, one of the things I think we're good at Able Partners is sort of identifying opportunities and trends before they hit mainstream, either the investor or even the consumer community. And I think, one of the reasons for that is we're non-traditional investors. The three partners were obviously all women. My co-founder, Lisa, grew up in a border town in Texas. I grew up in a, very rural community in Vermont. So I think we come at things both from, our experience of having a very non-coastal upbringing, but at the same time now having the huge privilege to be able to see things through that lens. And so I think that it was easy enough for us to see within, the numbers are, pretty obvious when you look at, really upsetting in terms of 1 in 5 Americans having a diagnosable mental illness, the 1 in 8 adults being on an SSRI, and you see all of those numbers. Clearly the opportunity is there. but we were also able to see how did that interact with people's lives when they were on these wellness journeys. As I said, that's where we started, and to see how much of that was really being driven by maybe mental health needs.
And you had mentioned something about you called yourself a non-traditional investor. And I think that's really interesting because we've seen the venture capital landscape starting to be disrupted a little bit by rolling funds and syndicates and hedge funds being aggressive in investing in the venture space and coming down into the early stage illiquid markets. How do you sort of define non-traditional, and what do you think the advantages are of being a non-traditional investor?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of different flavors of non-traditional, and I think you and I represent two different flavors of that. For us, what I mean when I say that, first of all, we don't look like your average venture partner, certainly fund founder. That has been talked a lot about, but we also have a non-traditional fund structure. So we have an evergreen capital pool, which means we recycle our capital. We're backed by family office investors. So we don't have a traditional, 10-year VC timeline. It allows us, we believe, to partner with founders in a more sustainable way. I think, when we look at what are some of the problems with institutional investing, I do think that, time horizon leads to bad decision making, which is not always in the best interest of founders and companies and outcomes. So that's one area where, we are able, I think, to collaborate and partner with people a little differently than others. It also allows us, frankly, to invest in things that others have not been able to invest in. So we mentioned, therapeutic psychedelics. One of the reasons we were able to be one of the first is that we don't have fund restrictions on, the thin investment areas where people had lumped those compounds. And frankly, we've invested in stuff that's been a little bit on the fringe from the beginning, with the belief that with more research and education, many of those things would become mainstream. And lucky enough to see that having taken place. So, it gives us a lot more freedom to do things like that I don't think we would have in a traditional fund structure. And it allows us to invest across stages, across instruments, and like I said, across categories in a way that not all traditional funds are able to do.
I wanted to ask you because I think you've done probably more than most in the mental health space in terms of investing. You've been investing in it longer than most. What are some themes you're noticing in the mental health startup landscape around who's doing what, where people are finding success? What are some themes you've noticed, and where do you think the biggest opportunities are for investors and founders and broadly in the mental health space today?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. We're seeing, first of all, like I said, we're seeing an incredible amount of interest from the investor community now. So I think that's a good thing. I think that we need innovation, and I think that's what you're starting to see in some of the themes that we're still interested in and paying attention to. First of all, around accessibility. So, increasing access to affordable, high quality providers. And that includes for underserved populations like Medicaid, where we haven't seen as much innovation, but have started to see some work there. It's obviously a large population, and it has some degree of complexity in terms of serving that population. But as we know, complexity can also mean barrier to entry in terms of value creation. So I think that's one bucket that we're still interested in and keeping an eye on. I think, the ability to develop personalized and integrated care. So people talk about personalized medicine, and, there are varying degrees of what that actually means. But certainly one of the big things that we talk about is really the lack of, despite the sort of monolithic labels that are given to many of these conditions, the fact that most people don't respond to first line treatments, and the need to personalize approaches is very important, and area of still huge opportunity. And I think similar to that, integrated care. So depending upon where you fall sort of in terms of needs in the mental wellness spectrum, the ability to coordinate different types of interventions and care more seamlessly than people right now who maybe have a psychiatrist in one place and a therapist in another place, and other supportive therapies without somebody coordinating all of that, I think is an important thing as well. And then, maybe I should have started here. I think the area that we have been most interested in sort of after the therapeutic psychedelics. So we think that, therapeutic psychedelics was, something that we started looking at maybe 4 years ago, has had a lot more interest lately. But in terms of interventions, we can talk about how it's a huge and growing problem, and our existing solutions are really inadequate. They're marginally effective, huge side effects, long lag time to efficacy. And at the same time, you're showing a lack of competition, unfortunately, because we would like to see more innovation in the category, with the pharma giants cutting their research on psychiatric medicine by 70% over the last 10 years. Depression drug candidates represent only 0.2% of the global drug pipeline, despite that being one of the leading causes of mental illness. And so, we first identified therapeutic psychedelics as being a really important intervention to actually create change at scale. And then realized that, as important as that is, really one of the opportunities that's related and possibly even bigger is a need to have better measurement and monitoring solutions. So why is the brain the only organ system as it relates to mental health that we diagnose based on subjective self-reported criteria? Why do people who have depression get given the same first line treatment when one person's depression could be related to gut dysbiosis? One person's depression could be related to grief after, a loss. Somebody else's depression could be related to childhood trauma. These different conditions, again, they have a monolithic diagnosis right now, but they really are different conditions and logically have different interventions that would work. So, it's sort of related to the fact that the pharma companies have, to a certain degree, thrown up their hands in terms of investing more dollars behind finding solutions for mental health, because it's been very difficult to show successful trials when you're calling everybody who's not feeling well one label of depression, let's say, or anxiety. So we think that there is a huge opportunity now in the measurement and monitoring space. And I know we've done some of this work together, and we continue to be interested in it, and have backed several companies in the space who can begin to create more detail in terms of what a diagnosis looks like, and then therefore hopefully be able to run more successful trials, have more successful interventions, and then the monitoring piece related to that, to be able to track large population health over time and intervene hopefully early before you have a decompensation event, which is distressing both to the individual and expensive to the healthcare system.
I had made a joke about us being kind of what if ventures being somewhat late to the party and you being very early to the party, but that's sort of from the context or the point of view of a venture investor operating on venture timelines. It feels like, to me, from what you're saying, it's still really the early days in the mental health space. It sounds like there's the way you see it is there are quite a few frontiers that we've barely even seen the tip of the iceberg in. Is that how you see the market? It's just we're still super early.
Yeah, I think this is something that I struggle to remind myself, and I still the thing that I always think about is in my hedge fund days, I had an investor at the firm who had, in New York City, everybody had decided that Uggs were passé and nobody was going to wear them, and so shorted the stock, many years before the rest of America got the memo. And so I'm very conscious that even though I, have been heavily steeped in the therapeutic psychedelic space and the mental health space for several years now, and it may feel like the momentum is such that, the peak has passed, unfortunately, these are huge problems causing, untold economic and personal devastation, and the need for interventions. Yeah, you're right. I think we're still in the early innings. I think it's still just the beginning. I think there is so much room for improvement, and exciting to see that now that there are venture dollars behind it, we can start to make more progress more quickly.
I feel the same way sometimes. I feel like sometimes you get 3 or 4 years into a thesis or into a market, and you start seeing that all this money's coming in. A lot of investors are investing in the space. Valuations across the landscape are high. There's no doubt. And so it makes you start to think, has it already been done, or are we just beginning? So it's such a hard question for investors to try to digest, I think.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that, unfortunately, just given the scale of the problem and I think the complexity of the solutions that will be needed, you're right. We have a long way to go.
At Able, what are you looking for in terms of stage or check size or scale? What's the sweet spot for you all?
So we generally invest pre-seed through Series A, seed and Series A being more of our sweet spot, but we do opportunistically invest later where we feel like something is very mission aligned or synergistic with our existing portfolio. So, depending upon it does depend on the category. within the mental health space, we are very humble and self-aware that, we are not scientists, and we are not technology experts. So there are certain categories where we need to see a little bit more traction because we're not able, we believe, to make an informed decision about the science really early on in some of these categories. But generally speaking, we are early stage investors.
You've seen a lot in this space, and you've invested in a lot in this space. You've seen companies exit and be successful. You've seen the whole life cycle of a business in this space. If you could build anything, knowing what you know now about the industry, knowing what you know now about investors in the space and founders in the space and the problem sets, and just ignore all the rules, ignore how much money it would take, ignore how long it would take, ignore, physics and all those weird things. What's the thing you would make if you could make anything to help people with their mental health now that you've spent so much time in this area?
I have not been asked that question before. It's a great question, and I'm afraid I don't have a great answer for it. Sort of hung up my founder hat a few years ago,
I know.
and that's a hard job. One thing that I didn't start, and somebody else has started, but we were involved early on in the incubation. AliCor has incubated Capable Health. What I like about that in terms of ability to help people, putting aside the two big interventions that we discussed in terms of new treatments via psychedelics and measurement and monitoring, we get pitched a lot on these point solutions for, I guess it relates back to the personalized medicine thesis, which are point solutions for small communities. So the addressable market might be small. We get pitched some pretty specific solutions where we feel like we would want to support that solution because we know it's a real need. But when we look at an addressable market of people with a certain condition falling into a certain geographic or other category, it's hard to underwrite as a venture scalable investment. And if we don't think that venture investment is the right solution for a certain company to start, and there are a lot of great companies, but not all of them should be venture funded because that comes with its own set of growth expectations and return expectations, and in some ways can be harmful, I think, for founders. I'm a big believer that venture is not good for everybody, but there are solutions that have, that can do good in the world and have a group of people that would be interested in paying for them. And so what I like about Capable is that they are enabling patient-centered behavioral change sort of as a service. So chronic care providers can use the Capable API to create patient apps with less engineering effort. So you can think about it like the API that Calm or Headspace or Noom would have been used if they were starting those businesses, today. And that empowers some of these solutions that are more niche focused to scale quicker without the same investment. And I think that, for me, that was a nice compromise as a way to both validate the fact that there are solutions that are being brought to market that are needed and provide value and will be used by a group of people, but not a large enough group of people that would make sense from a venture investment perspective. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Oh, that's fascinating. That's really interesting. And you had mentioned something about stigma and destigmatization, and I share this view with you that there are these stigmatized problems. Stigma is going down in a lot of respects around mental health and around other health indications. What's driving that? Why is stigma suddenly decreasing around a lot of these indications, and how far do we have to go there? Because it's really unlocking this flood of demand for services that people have never demanded before because they've been ashamed or afraid or felt guilty or not wanted to ask for help around these indications, mental health being one of them. And so I think it's important to kind of understand this destigmatization process. Is it because of COVID? Was it happening before COVID? Like, kind of, how do you think about that?
yeah, I mean, I think because COVID did create so much more mental distress, and we have numbers around the number of people who are impacted and affected by that, I think people have been more willing to talk about it. But it's culturally something that's been happening for a while, and I think you see that with Gen Z, that they're more willing to talk about it, and that changes the conversation for the entire culture, for the better. And I think it's sort of fascinating when you've seen a couple of athletes recently being willing to talk about it. And, if you rewind 20 years and there were similar instances where athletes tried to talk about their mental health, they did not receive, right, the same type of support that people are receiving today. And I think that's just indicative of the shift. And the more that you have public figures as well as people one-on-one to their friends talking about their own experience, I find that when we talk about our theses around mental health, when I'm talking with somebody, it's usually the first conversation, but definitely by the second conversation, they're telling me about themselves or a close family member or friend who has suffered from serious mental illness. It is something that is, I think even I've been surprised at how common it is, and yet how little people talk about it. And I think we can thank some of the younger generation for bringing those conversations into the open.
I agree with you. I think it's really creating markets in places where markets didn't exist before. And mental health, I believe, is one of those markets. I mean, it certainly existed before, but it's growing and it's expanding and it's maturing. And I think that what we're finding is that the market for mental health care and services is so much bigger than what we thought, and then bigger than what some of our data so far even says, because so many people have just been in the dark. So many people have been hiding, not willing to come out and ask for help. And I think our market is actually drastically bigger than what any of the research reports have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And I think, when I talk about mental health, like, I don't believe that there's like somebody is mentally well or somebody's mentally ill. Like, mental health exists on a spectrum, and people come in and out of different areas of the spectrum. And there are life events which can push you towards one end or the other. And I think that, mental wellness, it's not something that people need to be in crisis to get support for. And in fact, if we can prevent some of those crises with early intervention, and so that's some of our interest around the pediatric mental health interventions, would be very important. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's sort of stunning to me the number of Americans, as we mentioned already, that are on SSRIs, and they're getting those prescriptions from their general practitioner primarily. They're not even going to a mental health care specialist to talk about it. And so I think that we have a lot of room.
What do you think solves that dynamic around? I mean, look, 80 something, 90, 85% of antidepressants are prescribed by primary care providers. There's obviously not enough mental health care providers. It takes a long time to make one. What is it that's going to solve that gap between supply and demand? I mean, it almost seems insurmountable in some ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, so I'm sure, you're well aware of the lack of psychiatrists in a number of counties in the United States who don't even have access to psychiatrists, right? So one of the things that I think is interesting is, how do we create some of these integrated care models that allow you to leverage the psychiatrist on the medication management side, with people who are supporting mental health from a therapy side or from other types of interventions? Because we do have, we have a number of different mental health service providers who cannot prescribe medicine but can provide great value. And if you could integrate those people who know the patient, who are working with the patient, and have a better connection with a psychiatrist who's doing the medication management side, can you leverage the psychiatrist's time while at the same time providing, better, more seamless, more personalized care to the end patient? I mean, I think that's something that we're going to have to look at. And, frankly, big picture, I think we all hope, these treatments with, SSRIs, there's not necessarily an endpoint when people go on those medications, although people do go on and off them. They tend to be longer duration. So I think some of the new treatments that we're exploring, certainly lifestyle interventions, have a big role to play. And there's a lot of room to make those more accessible to people and more effective. But also some of the interventions like psychedelics, which might not be a one and done, but are more likely to be episodic, or for some people, really just one or two treatments, so that you're not having to continually provide medication management.
Yeah, I just think there's so much opportunity in this space, and I think there's so many solutions we haven't even thought of yet. I honestly believe that mental health becomes the front door of the healthcare system broadly. I think that might be pretty far out there, but I think most people think of healthcare as this industry where mental health is a subset of it. And from my own personal experience, just living on this planet as a human, as an addict, living in recovery, having struggled with my mental health, I think mental health is my health, and all of my physical health care is actually a byproduct of it. I actually hope the world moves to that perspective. I don't know how long that will take, but I hope we get there.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're absolutely right. And the reason I think you're getting, payers willing to pay more attention to the mental health side now is that they recognize that that's not in a silo, right? That the people who are struggling with mental health have more physical health problems, and that's expensive, and that's what they care about. And if we can get people to recognize that connection, hopefully we can increase accessibility to some of these options by getting various payers to cover treatment. I think that's, obviously one of the big challenges.
You'd mentioned the payers, and so that brings up an idea around the future of mental health care and who pays for it. I mean, do you see, or do you think it might be both, but do you think that mental health care solutions are should be direct to consumer solutions, or should they be paid for by an employer, or should they be paid for by a payer, or is it some mix of all three, which is probably the answer? And if so, how does that unfold over time? I mean, is this something I should be paying for myself, or should somebody else be paying for this for me?
I mean, that's a great question, and I think it brings up a broader question about the U.S. healthcare system, right? And so we have, we spend more per capita than any other nation on healthcare, and yet we have the worst outcomes of developed nations, right? So, something is very broken in our healthcare system, and that's the system we also have. So I do think that there's room to reevaluate what are the right business models here. And that's a really big question. And that's a really big task to undertake. I'm hopeful that as we introduce things like value based care, we will see a more thoughtful, effective, and humane approach to healthcare, both mental and physical health. But again, we're sort of working in this legacy system that unfortunately doesn't work that well. I believe in mental health parity in terms of reimbursement from just a human perspective, but I think you can also make that economic argument that any healthcare provider should be covering mental health care given the impact on health outcomes across the board. But I'm sort of disappointed with how slow that's been moving, and I'm hoping that some of these technology enabled solutions will, to your point, should it be direct to consumer or not? Some of the innovations that some of the direct to consumer companies are introducing will hopefully increase accessibility across the board and be able to, back to the measurement idea, measurement is also around outcomes. So if we can prove better outcomes, hopefully we can increase reimbursement.
Why do you think we've done such a bad job measuring? It's interesting because, you think about in all other areas of healthcare, we've done a pretty good job of figuring out how to measure the heart or measure the broken leg we've figured out how to measure the outcome of the care we provide to some other part of our body, but we really have no idea what works on our brain. We just have we neglected it? Do we not know how? Like, why is measurement and testing such a gaping hole in the landscape around mental health?
That's a great question, and it's probably above my pay grade, but
That's why I asked you, because I certainly don't have the answer.
yeah, I mean, I think it's probably, if I were to just guess off the top of my head, related to several factors. One, stigma. So it's been something that's been silent and in the background. For a long time, we thought that we're sort of the blame the victim mentality here, and personal responsibility, or it's your cold mother, or whatever it was, as opposed to being willing to look for a biological basis for these conditions. So I think it requires something of a new cultural narrative to understand that there could be a biological basis here. And then the fact that the central nervous system is a very complex system, and so frankly it's just more difficult to create accurate measurement and monitoring and biomarkers where it relates to the central nervous system. But I think people probably weren't looking as hard because we thought we had it solved. You were weak-willed. You weren't trying hard enough. You were sort of choosing, as opposed to recognizing that there's a biological basis for many of these things.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And that's way above my pay grade. So I definitely do not have the answer, but you are smarter than I am. And so I wanted to get your take on it. I've really enjoyed getting to chat with you. I've enjoyed getting to work with you over the last couple of years, and I'm grateful that you take time today to come and chat with us and chat in front of our audience. And I like to always ask people, what did I miss? What should I have asked you that I overlooked about you, about Able Partners, about the mental health space? I'm sure I missed something obvious. I usually do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you've missed anything at all. I mean, I think when when we look at the mental health space, I'll just add that, I think I've already communicated, but we look at it, very broadly. So, it's not just within necessarily what's traditionally considered mental health. We have an area of interest around search for meaning, which we think is a core component of wellness and mental wellness. We look at opportunities in the care economy and the care infrastructure because that burden has significant mental health impacts. So I think sort of, to your point that, your mental health is your health. I think so many of these things are interconnected and there's so much opportunity for improvement. So, excited to keep collaborating with, great focused investors like yourself and hopefully get to see some much needed innovation brought to market.
And what's the best way for people to get in touch with you? Is it LinkedIn? Do you want us to put your email in the show notes? What's the best way for people to connect with you?
LinkedIn works. We also have a info@ablepartners.nyc email that we checked. Either of those are good ways to reach out.
Awesome. I will include those in the show notes. And thank you so much for doing this. I've really enjoyed getting to chat with you and educate our audience on what Able Partners is doing and why I think you guys honestly are the best investors in the space, in my opinion. It's such an honor to get to work with you. So thank you for coming on and chatting with us.
You're making me blush. It's been wonderful to collaborate with you as well. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you again, Amanda, for being here today and for sharing with us. Thank you for the kind words. I really look up to your work in our space. And honestly, I trust your insights and opinions on the mental health space greatly. There are a number of ways to connect with Amanda. I will link to those in the show notes. And to our listeners, thank you for being here. And please, if you like the content, give us a subscribe or a like or a review on your podcast platform of choice. And more importantly, we'd love it if you'd share this episode with a friend. To the founders out there, don't forget to join the Mental Health Startup Slack community, which you can also find a link to in the show notes. And also check out the What If Fellowship program, which is an 8-week accelerator designed to help mental health and digital health startups validate their ideas, perfect their business plan, and prepare to pitch to investors. You can learn more about that through the fellowship tab on the What If Ventures website or via a link in the show notes. Finally, we want to hear from our listeners. Please do comment on social media. Let us know what you'd like to hear more of, what you agreed with, what you disagreed with. You can check us out on Twitter at StigmaCast, on Instagram at Stigma Podcast. You can email us at info@stigmapodcast.com, and you can find us on our website at stigmapodcast.com as well. Thank you again for being here. And until next time, stay safe, be well, and thank you for your support.